You think she even speaks English? Marcus didn't bother lowering his voice as he smirked across the mahogany table. His partner chuckled back. Probably just here to pour wine and look pretty. Easy money. That's how it started. A $2.3 billion pharmaceutical merger hanging in the balance. A Japanese billionaire pushed to his breaking point, and a room full of executives who had no idea they were about to witness something that would destroy careers and rewrite the rules of power forever. In the corner, unnoticed and underestimated, Sophia Martinez refilled water glasses with the precision of a trained dancer. She wasn't just serving dinner, she was watching an empire about to crumble. And when Hiroshi Nakamura finally exploded in furious Japanese, screaming words that shook the crystal chandeliers, every man in that room sat frozen, confused, helpless. Every man except Sophia. Because she understood every single word. What happened next wasn't just a business deal gone wrong. It was a masterclass in why you should never ever underestimate the quiet ones. This is a story about language, power, and the moment when being invisible becomes your greatest weapon. Stay with me. You're going to want to hear this one. The elevator doors opened to reveal what money could buy when conscience wasn't part of the equation. Azure Heights occupied the entire 47th floor of the Chrysler Building, where Manhattan's elite came not just to dine, but to devour. The walls weren't just painted. They were sculpted from Italian marble that cost more per square foot than most people's annual salaries. Crystal chandeliers didn't just hang. They commanded the space like frozen fireworks, casting shadows that danced across handcrafted Persian rugs worth more than luxury cars. This wasn't a restaurant. This was a temple to excess, where deals worth billions were sealed with handshakes that could topple governments. And tonight, in the most exclusive private dining room, something was about to go very, very wrong. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Hiroshi Nakamura's Zen Pharmaceuticals represented more than just another acquisition target. It was the crown jewel of Japanese biotech innovation. 50 years of research, breakthrough cancer treatments that had saved millions of lives worldwide. A family legacy built on honor, precision, and the kind of scientific breakthroughs that Hollywood movies are made of. But to the men sitting across from him tonight, those 50 years of dedication looked like nothing more than dollar signs and market share percentages. They saw an aging foreign businessman who spoke broken English and seemed out of his depth in their world of power suits and aggressive negotiations. They had no idea they were staring at a man who had built an empire from nothing, who spoke 4 languages fluently, and who was about to teach them the most expensive lesson of their careers. The American side came prepared for war disguised as diplomacy. Marcus Webb, CEO of MedCorp Industries, sat at the head of the table like a king surveying his soon-to-be kingdom. His custom-tailored Armani suit probably cost more than Sophia made in 3 months, and he wore it with the casual arrogance of someone who had never been told no in a boardroom. Flanking him were his lieutenants, cold-eyed executives with Harvard MBAs and shark-like grins, each one calculating how Hiroshi's company would look carved up and distributed among their existing portfolios. They had flown in on private jets, stayed in penthouse suites, and brought contracts that read more like surrender documents than partnership agreements. To them, this wasn't a negotiation. It was an execution, and Hiroshi Nakamura was the condemned man who just didn't know it yet. But they had made one critical miscalculation. In their rush to claim victory, they had forgotten that respect isn't purchased with quarterly earnings or intimidated with legal jargon. Hiroshi might have been sitting quietly, might have been struggling with his English, might have seemed overwhelmed by their aggressive tactics. But he wasn't weak. He was observing, calculating, waiting. Every condescending smile, every dismissive gesture, every moment they treated his life's work like a commodity to be stripped and sold. He was filing it all away. And in the background, moving with the fluid grace of someone trained to be invisible, Sophia Martinez was watching too, refilling wine glasses with hands that never trembled, clearing plates with movements that never disturbed the conversation, listening to every word with ears that missed nothing. She saw the tension building in Hiroshi's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened with each insult disguised as a compliment. The irony was perfect in its cruelty. Here was a room full of the most powerful men in American pharmaceuticals, convinced they were about to pull off the deal of the century, completely unaware that their own arrogance was setting them up for total destruction. They saw a language barrier and assumed it meant a power imbalance. They heard broken English and concluded broken spirit. They looked at Hiroshi's quiet dignity and mistook it for weakness, his cultural politeness for submission. And Sophia, she was just the help. Background noise. A pretty face to serve expensive wine and disappear back into invisibility. None of them had any idea that the woman they barely noticed, the one they treated like furniture, was about to become the most important person in that room. Because sometimes the people you never see are the ones who see everything. And tonight, everyone was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Hiroshi Nakamura carried himself like royalty, because in many ways he was. Third-generation heir to a pharmaceutical empire that began in post-war Japan with nothing but determination and a chemistry set in a bombed-out basement. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his navy suit immaculate, but it was his eyes that told the real story, dark, intelligent, and carrying the weight of decisions that had affected millions of lives. At 72, he had survived market crashes, hostile takeovers, and family betrayals that would have destroyed weaker men. His hands, steady as a surgeon's, had signed deals that brought life-saving medications to third-world countries at cost. Tonight, those same hands would be tested in ways he never imagined. Because respect, he was about to learn, wasn't a universal language. Marcus Webb looked like he had been born in a boardroom and raised on quarterly reports, 6'3", with the kind of commanding presence that came from never losing, never apologizing, and never looking back. His blonde hair was silver at the temples, not from age but from stress, the kind that came from managing a company worth $40 billion while sleeping 3 hours a night. His handshake could crush fingers, his smile could freeze blood, and his laugh could make grown executives quit their jobs. He wore power like cologne, thick and impossible to ignore, but tonight his confidence would become his weakness. Because the thing about always winning is that it makes you forget what losing feels like. And Marcus Webb was about to get a masterclass in humility. The supporting cast read like a who's who of corporate America's most ruthless. James Crawford, MedCorp's head of acquisitions, sat with the predatory stillness of a man who specialized in dismantling companies and selling off the pieces. Sarah Chen, their lead counsel, had never lost a negotiation in 15 years. Her reputation was built on finding legal loopholes that could justify any business decision. And then there was David Park, the numbers man, whose spreadsheets could make billion-dollar companies disappear with the click of a mouse. They were sharks in expensive suits, circling what they believed was wounded prey. Each one had already mentally spent their acquisition bonuses, already planned their victory speeches, already decided how Hiroshi's life work would be rebranded and redistributed. They saw an old Japanese man struggling with English and assumed they were dealing with an easy target. But the most dangerous person in that room wasn't wearing a $1,000 suit or carrying a Harvard MBA. Sophia Martinez moved through the space like water, fluid and unnoticed, her presence so seamless that conversations continued as if she were invisible. 26 years old, with the kind of quiet beauty that came from intelligence rather than makeup, she carried herself with a dancer's grace and a diplomat's awareness. Her black hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her uniform pressed and professional, but her eyes missed nothing. She had learned long ago that being underestimated was sometimes the greatest advantage of all. Because while everyone else was performing their roles, showing off their power and importance, Sophia was learning their secrets. And tonight, those secrets would change everything. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room is the one no one bothers to notice. The first 30 minutes felt like watching a slow-motion car crash that hadn't happened yet. Hiroshi spoke in careful, measured English, each word chosen with the precision of a man translating complex thoughts through an unfamiliar language. His sentences came out stilted, formal, missing the nuanced persuasion that had built his empire back in Japan. The translator beside him, a nervous young man who kept wiping sweat from his forehead, struggled to bridge the gap between Hiroshi's sophisticated ideas and the American's impatience. Every pause, every search for the right English word, every moment of cultural hesitation was being interpreted as weakness by the wolves across the table. Marcus tapped his fingers against the mahogany, his smile growing sharper with each stumbled phrase. The language barrier wasn't just communication, it was becoming a weapon. Marcus leaned back in his leather chair with the casual arrogance of a man who had never met a problem he couldn't bulldoze through with money and aggression. "Look, Hiroshi," he said, using the first name with deliberate familiarity, "we're all businessmen here. Let's cut through the cultural formalities and talk numbers." His tone was the kind reserved for children or employees about to be fired, patient on the surface, condescending underneath. James Crawford chuckled and added, "We've done our homework on your operation. Very quaint, traditional, but the global market requires a different approach." The word traditional dripped with dismissal, as if 50 years of pharmaceutical innovation was somehow outdated because it came from Japan. Sarah Chen nodded in agreement, shuffling papers with theatrical importance. They weren't having a conversation. They were conducting an interrogation disguised as a business meeting. The translator was drowning. Every technical term became a stumbling block. Every cultural reference got lost in literal translation. Every subtle business strategy emerged as confused fragments that made Hiroshi sound uncertain when he was actually being diplomatic. "Mr. Nakamura says he wants to preserve the essence of the research integrity," the young man stammered, completely missing the sophisticated argument Hiroshi had just made about maintaining quality standards during the merger. David Park rolled his eyes so dramatically it was almost audible. "Preserve the essence?" he repeated mockingly. "What are we buying here, a company or a philosophy class?" The room erupted in polite laughter, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny, but to establish dominance. Hiroshi's jaw tightened imperceptibly, a muscle jumping near his left temple, but he remained silent, dignified, waiting. From her position at the wine station, Sophia watched the cultural assassination happening in real time. She understood every word Hiroshi spoke in Japanese to his translator before it got butchered in English. She saw the frustration building behind his carefully controlled expression, the way his hands gripped his water glass just a little tighter with each dismissive comment. What these men interpreted as confusion or weakness, Sophia recognized as restraint, the kind that came from a lifetime of discipline and honor. She had seen this before, growing up as a diplomat's daughter, watching her mother navigate rooms full of people who underestimated her accent, her appearance, her right to be there. The difference was, Hiroshi had built a pharmaceutical empire worth billions. He wasn't lost or confused. He was being deliberately misunderstood. And Sophia could see the storm gathering behind his polite smile, the pressure building toward an explosion that would shatter every assumption in that room. The papers hit the table with a sound like a judge's gavel sealing a death sentence. Marcus slid the revised contract across the polished mahogany with the casual confidence of a man delivering an ultimatum disguised as a gift. "We've streamlined the terms," he announced, his voice carrying the false warmth of a used car salesman closing a deal on a lemon. The document was thick, bound in expensive leather, filled with legal language designed to confuse and intimidate. But the numbers were clear enough. 60% staff reduction in the first quarter, immediate closure of 3 research facilities in Japan, and complete transfer of all intellectual property to MedCorp's American operations. What Marcus was calling streamlined was actually corporate execution. He was buying Hiroshi's life work for the sole purpose of gutting it, stripping out the valuable patents and discarding the rest like yesterday's newspaper. The translator's hands shook as he flipped through the pages, his voice cracking as he attempted to explain terms that seemed designed to humiliate rather than negotiate. They want to reorganize the research division, consolidate operations in America, transfer key personnel. Each euphemism landed like a physical blow. Reorganize meant fire, consolidate meant destroy, transfer meant steal. Hiroshi listened with the stoic patience of a man watching his family's legacy being sold at a garage sale. His father had started Zen Pharmaceuticals in 1952 with a dream of making medicine affordable for everyone. His grandfather had been a traditional healer who believed in treating the person, not just the disease. 3 generations of dedication, innovation, and honor were being reduced to line items in a spreadsheet, valued only for their potential to increase MedCorp's quarterly profits. The beauty of this arrangement, Sarah Chen added with the clinical precision of a coroner explaining cause of death, is that we can maintain the Zen brand for sentimental value while optimizing the actual operations for maximum efficiency. Her smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Maximum efficiency. Earn corporate speak. That meant firing every Japanese employee, moving production to the cheapest facilities available, and replacing carefully researched formulations with whatever generated the highest profit margins. James Crawford nodded enthusiastically. We're talking about taking a regional company and making it truly global. Your father would be proud to see his work reaching such a massive scale. The irony was breathtaking. They were destroying everything Hiroshi's father had built, while claiming it was an honor to his memory. Hiroshi's English began to crack under the weight of what he was hearing. My research team. They are... He struggled for words, his accent thickening with emotion, his sentences fragmenting as he tried to process the magnitude of the betrayal being presented as a business opportunity. The translator, overwhelmed by the technical jargon and legal complexities, was making everything worse, turning Hiroshi's sophisticated concerns into broken fragments that made him sound confused rather than concerned. David Park seized on the moment like a predator sensing weakness. Look, we understand this is emotional for you. Change is always hard, but you have to trust us to know what's best for your company's future. Trust them to know what's best for his company. The condescension was so thick you could have bottled it and sold it as arrogance cologne. Sophia gripped the wine decanter so tightly her knuckles went white. She understood every word of Hiroshi's whispered Japanese as he spoke to himself, not to the translator, not to the room, but to his father's memory, asking forgiveness for what he was about to allow to happen to their family's work. "Oto-san, gomen nasai," he whispered. "Father, I'm sorry." The Americans heard gibberish. Sophia heard a man's heart breaking in real time. She watched Marcus glance at his Rolex, saw James Crawford's impatient foot tapping, witnessed Sarah Chen's theatrical yawn. They weren't just buying a company, they were conducting a public execution and charging admission. And the most tragic part was that Hiroshi, in his dignity and cultural politeness, was about to let them get away with it. Unless someone in that room found the courage to speak up. Someone they would never see coming. The transformation began like a pressure cooker, reaching its breaking point, slowly, then all at once. Hiroshi's face, which had maintained the serene composure of a Buddhist monk throughout 2 hours of systematic humiliation, began to show hairline cracks in its facade. His breathing became shallow, deliberate, the kind that comes before an explosion. The translator, sensing the shift in atmospheric pressure, started sweating more profusely, dabbing his forehead with a napkin that was already soaked through. Marcus, completely oblivious to the volcanic activity building across from him, was explaining how they planned to rebrand the Zen philosophy to appeal to Western sensibilities, corporate speak for erasing every trace of Japanese culture from the company. He was describing the cultural genocide of everything Hiroshi held sacred while expecting him to smile and be grateful for the privilege. That's when something inside Japan's most respected pharmaceutical pioneer finally snapped. It started with a single word, spoken so quietly that only Sophia caught it. "Yamero." Stop. Hiroshi's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of 3 generations of honor being trampled underfoot. The translator, completely focused on Marcus's latest condescending explanation, missed it entirely. "Yamero," Hiroshi repeated, slightly louder now, his hands beginning to tremble, not from fear, but from rage that had been building for hours. Still, no one at the table paid attention. They were too busy calculating their bonuses, too absorbed in their own perceived cleverness to notice that the man they were destroying was about to destroy them right back. Marcus actually chuckled at something David Park whispered, completely unaware that he was laughing while standing on top of a landmine. The fuse had been lit. The countdown had begun. Then Hiroshi exploded like Mount Fuji after centuries of dormancy. He shot to his feet so violently that his chair flew backward, crashing into the marble wall with a sound like thunder. His voice, no longer the careful, measured English of a man trying to be understood, erupted in rapid-fire Japanese that filled the room like a tsunami of pure fury. Fuzakeru na! Watashi no kazoku no isan wo baka ni suru na! The words came out like machine gun fire, each syllable loaded with decades of suppressed rage, cultural pride, and the pain of watching everything his family had built being treated like garbage. His hands slammed against the table, making the crystal glasses jump and the expensive china rattle. The sound echoed off the marble walls like gunshots, and suddenly the most exclusive dining room in Manhattan felt like a war zone. The Americans froze like deer caught in headlights, their confident smirks evaporating as they realized they had just witnessed something they couldn't control, couldn't manipulate, couldn't buy their way out of. Marcus's mouth hung open. David Park's pen stopped mid-calculation. Sarah Chen's papers scattered as she flinched away from the table. The translator had gone completely white, his hands shaking as he tried to process the torrent of Japanese fury that was still pouring out of Hiroshi like water from a broken dam. Anatira tachi wa nani mo wakatte inai. Kono kaisha wa watashi no inochi da. The words kept coming, faster and more furious, each sentence another indictment of their greed, their disrespect, their complete failure to understand what they were trying to destroy. And in the corner of the room, unnoticed by everyone except the woman who understood every devastating word, Hiroshi Nakamura was finally telling these men exactly what he thought of them and their blood-soaked contract. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Hiroshi's heavy breathing and the soft clink of crystal still settling from the shock waves. Marcus looked around the room desperately, as if someone might materialize with subtitles for the verbal annihilation he had just witnessed. What did he say?" he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. The translator, still pale as death, opened his mouth but no words came out. He was either too shocked or too smart to repeat what he had just heard. James Crawford nervously adjusted his tie. Sarah Chen shuffled her papers with trembling hands, and David Park stared at his laptop screen like it might provide an escape route. They had spent 2 hours systematically dismantling a man's life work while expecting him to thank them for it, and now they were discovering that dignity, when pushed too far, becomes something far more dangerous. They were about to learn that the quiet ones aren't quiet because they're weak. They're quiet because when they finally speak, they bring the whole house down. Sophia's hands had stopped moving. For the first time all evening, the wine decanter remained motionless in her grip as she stood frozen by the service station, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. Every instinct screamed at her to stay invisible, to keep playing her role, to let this disaster unfold without getting involved. She was just the help, just background scenery in a drama worth billions of dollars. Her manager's warning echoed in her mind. Smile, serve, and disappear. That's how you keep this job. But Hiroshi's words, his raw, anguished Japanese, had cut through her professional composure like a sword through silk. She understood every syllable of his pain, every accusation of dishonor, every cry for his father's forgiveness. And suddenly staying silent felt like being complicit in a crime. The woman who had spent years perfecting the art of invisibility was about to step into the brightest spotlight of her life. The decision crystallized in a moment that felt both instantaneous and eternal. Sophia set down the wine decanter with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed, each gesture carrying the weight of a choice that would change everything. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin and began walking toward the table, not with the hurried, apologetic steps of service staff, but with the measured confidence of someone who belonged in the conversation. Her footsteps on the marble floor sounded like a drumbeat, each step announcing that the invisible woman was about to become the most important person in the room. Marcus was still sputtering. "Someone translate that! What the hell did he just say?" His voice carried the petulant whine of a man accustomed to immediate answers, to having the world bend to his demands. But tonight, the world had other plans. Tonight, Sophia Martinez was about to change the rules entirely. When she reached Hiroshi's side, Sophia did something that stopped every conversation, every fidget, every nervous gesture in the room. She bowed. Not the perfunctory nod that Americans called a bow, but the deep, respectful bow of traditional Japanese culture, hands at her sides, back straight, head lowered in genuine reverence. It was the bow reserved for elders, for teachers, for people whose wisdom and experience demanded acknowledgement. The room went dead silent, as if someone had sucked all the air out through a vacuum. Marcus's mouth fell open. David Park's fingers froze over his keyboard. Sarah Chen's papers slipped from her hands and scattered across the floor like autumn leaves. Even the translator stopped sweating long enough to stare in shock, because in that single gesture, Sophia had accomplished something that 2 hours of aggressive negotiation couldn't. She had shown Hiroshi Nakamura the respect he deserved. When Sophia rose from her bow and looked directly into Hiroshi's eyes, she spoke in Japanese so perfect, so respectful, so beautifully crafted that it sounded like poetry set to the rhythm of justice. "Nakamura-sama," she began, her voice carrying the formal elegance of someone who truly understood the weight of the language she was speaking. "Watakushi wa fukaku owabi itashimasu. Watakushi wa hanasu beki de wa arimasen ga, kono yuna bujoku ni taishi, chinmoku wa uragiri no katachi desu. Moshi yurusarete itadakereba, otetsudai dekimasu." The words flowed like water over stone, each syllable pronounced with the precision of someone who had learned Japanese not as a foreign language, but as a second native tongue. And as the meaning of her words sank in, the apology for their disrespect, the acknowledgement of his dignity, the offer to help, Hiroshi's expression transformed from fury to something approaching wonder. Because for the first time all evening, someone in that room was actually seeing him, hearing him, treating him like the accomplished, intelligent, honorable man he was. The Americans sat in stunned silence, their brains struggling to process what they had just witnessed. The quiet Latina waitress, the one they had barely noticed, the one who had been invisible for the entire evening, had just spoken fluent Japanese with the formal elegance of a diplomat. Marcus blinked rapidly, as if trying to reset his vision. You speak Japanese?" he stammered, his voice cracking like a teenager asking someone to prom. Sophia turned to face him, and for the first time all evening, her expression held something other than professional neutrality. It held power. It held knowledge. And most terrifyingly for the men at that table, it held the promise that their comfortable assumptions about who mattered and who didn't were about to be completely, irrevocably shattered. "Yes," she said simply, her English now carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "I speak Japanese, and Mr. Nakamura has quite a lot to say about your offer." The translation that followed wasn't just words changing from one language to another. It was a surgical dissection of everything the Americans thought they knew about the man sitting across from them. Sophia's voice carried the crisp authority of a UN interpreter. Each English word chosen with the precision of someone who understood. That translation was about capturing souls, not just sentences. Mr. Nakamura said, and I quote, "You fools understand nothing. This company is not just my business. It is my life, my father's dream, and my grandfather's legacy rolled into one. You sit here like vultures, picking apart 50 years of honor while expecting me to smile and thank you for the privilege of watching you destroy everything I hold sacred." The words hit the table like physical blows, each sentence stripping away another layer of the Americans' comfortable assumptions. Marcus's face went from confident to confused to something approaching terror as he realized he wasn't dealing with a confused old man. He was facing a pharmaceutical genius who had been watching them reveal their true nature for 2 solid hours. Sophia continued with the relentless precision of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. He also said, "You want to fire my research team, men and women who have dedicated their lives to saving others, who work 18-hour days not for profit but for purpose. You want to close facilities where we've developed treatments that have saved millions of children from cancer, where we've created medications that cost pennies so that poor families don't have to choose between medicine and food." Her voice grew stronger with each revelation, as if Hiroshi's righteous anger was flowing through her and amplifying her own power. "And then you have the audacity to tell me my father would be proud? My father, who started this company with nothing but a belief that medicine should heal hearts as well as bodies? You would turn his legacy into another profit machine, another quarterly earnings report, another trophy on your corporate wall." The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by David Park's nervous pen clicking and Sarah Chen's shallow breathing. But Sophia wasn't finished. If anything, she was just getting started. "He said your contract isn't a business proposal. It's a death warrant. You're not buying Zen Pharmaceuticals, you're planning to murder it and wear its skin like a costume." James Crawford actually flinched at those words, his hand moving unconsciously to loosen his tie. You see a language barrier and think it makes him weak. But Mr. Nakamura speaks 4 languages fluently. He stayed quiet in English, not because he couldn't express himself, but because he wanted to see what kind of men you really were when you thought no one was listening. Sophia's eyes swept across the table, meeting each man's gaze in turn. He heard every condescending joke, every dismissive comment, every moment you treated him like an obstacle instead of a human being. And now he knows exactly who he's dealing with. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the full implications of what she was saying began to sink in. The final blow came with the quiet devastation of a master swordsman ending a duel with a single perfect strike. "Mr. Nakamura also wanted me to tell you that he's been recording this entire meeting." Sophia gestured toward Hiroshi's briefcase, where a small, sophisticated recording device sat in plain sight, so obvious that its very visibility had made it invisible to men too arrogant to imagine they were being monitored. Every joke about his English, every plan to gut his company, every moment you revealed your true intentions, it's all documented. He wanted to give you the chance to show him who you really were, and you exceeded even his worst expectations. Marcus went so pale he looked like he might faint, while Trent's confident smirk melted like ice cream in August heat. The beautiful irony is that you thought his silence made him helpless, when actually it made him dangerous, because while you were talking, he was listening. While you were performing, he was learning, and now he has everything he needs to destroy your reputations, your careers, and your company's stock price with a single phone call to the Wall Street Journal. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were just beginning to understand how thoroughly they had been outplayed. The backstory unraveled like a film reel spinning backward through time, revealing the woman who had been hiding in plain sight all evening. Sophia Martinez hadn't learned Japanese from textbooks or college courses. She had learned it the way children learn to breathe, naturally and completely, during 8 formative years in the diplomatic quarter of Tokyo. Her mother, Ambassador Elena Martinez, had been stationed there when Sophia was 10. A scared little girl who spoke only Spanish and broken English, thrust into a world where she looked different from everyone around her. But Japan had embraced her in ways that America never would. In the international school in Shibuya, she wasn't the Mexican girl or the diplomat's daughter. She was simply Sophia Chan, who could fold origami cranes during lunch and bow properly when meeting her sensei. The language flowed into her like water finding its level, each syllable becoming as natural as her own heartbeat. By the time they returned to the States, she dreamed in Japanese, thought in Japanese, and carried a piece of Japanese soul that would never leave her. But America had different plans for a young Latina woman, no matter how many languages she spoke or how many cultures she understood. The same intelligence that made her fluent in Japanese was dismissed when it came from someone who looked like the help rather than the Harvard graduates. Her applications to international relations programs were met with polite rejections despite perfect test scores. Her interviews for diplomatic positions ended with comments about her interesting background and promises to keep her resume on file. So she waited tables, cleaned offices, and served wine to people who never bothered to learn her name, all while carrying a master's degree in international studies that might as well have been written in invisible ink. She had learned to make herself small, to be grateful for whatever opportunities came her way, to smile and nod, while people who knew half of what she knew made decisions that affected millions. But tonight, watching Hiroshi's dignity being systematically destroyed, something in her refused to stay small any longer. The years of invisibility had taught Sophia skills that no business school could provide. She knew how to read body language across cultures, how to sense the moment when politeness turned to disrespect, how to recognize the difference between someone who was confused and someone who was being deliberately misunderstood. She had watched her mother navigate rooms full of men who questioned her authority, her intelligence, her right to be there. And she had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply being underestimated. While Marcus and his team saw a waitress, Sophia saw the chess game being played around the dinner table. Every move, every gesture, every carefully chosen word was part of a larger strategy that the Americans were too arrogant to recognize. Hiroshi wasn't lost in translation. He was gathering intelligence. He wasn't confused by their legal jargon. He was documenting their intent. And Sophia, invisible in her uniform, had become his inadvertent witness to every moment of their professional suicide. The recognition in Hiroshi's eyes when she spoke Japanese wasn't just gratitude. It was the profound relief of a man who had been drowning finally seeing a lifeline thrown from shore. He saw in Sophia the same thing she saw in him, someone whose worth was being measured by all the wrong metrics, someone whose intelligence was being dismissed because of assumptions about accent, appearance, and background. They were both foreigners in this room of American power brokers, both carrying stories that their observers couldn't imagine, both possessing knowledge that their detractors couldn't fathom. When Sophia offered to help translate, she wasn't just offering language skills, she was offering alliance, understanding, and the kind of respect that transcends cultural boundaries. In that moment, the invisible waitress and the underestimated billionaire became partners in what would soon become the most expensive lesson in humility that Marcus Webb and his team had ever received. Because sometimes the people you never see coming are the ones who change everything. The room's atmosphere shifted like weather before a hurricane, that electric tension when everyone knows something massive is about to happen, but no one knows exactly what form it will take. Marcus sat forward in his chair, his previous confidence cracking like ice under pressure, his hands gripping the table edge as if it could anchor him to a reality that was rapidly slipping away. "Now hold on just a minute," he stammered, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man who had just realized he was standing on quicksand. "This is highly irregular. We came here for a business negotiation, not some kind of cultural intervention." But even as he spoke, he could feel the power dynamic in the room shifting like tectonic plates, grinding and reshaping everything he thought he understood about this deal. Hiroshi, no longer the confused foreigner struggling with English, sat back in his chair with the serene confidence of a chess master who had just achieved checkmate in 12 moves. His dark eyes held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had allowed his opponents to reveal their true nature before destroying them completely. Sophia stepped closer to the table, no longer moving with the deferential posture of service staff, but with the commanding presence of someone who had just realized she held all the cards. "Mr. Nakamura would like to know if you'd prefer to hear his response to your contract in Japanese or English," she said, her voice carrying a new edge of authority that made several of the executives shift uncomfortably in their seats. "Because he's actually quite fluent in English, he just wanted to see how you behaved when you thought he couldn't understand your private comments." The words hung in the air like a sword suspended over the Americans' heads, each syllable a reminder of every dismissive joke, every condescending aside, every moment they had revealed their true intentions while thinking they were speaking to a harmless old man who couldn't follow their conversation. David Park's laptop screen reflected his pale face as he stared at it, probably calculating exactly how much damage this recording could do to MedCorp's stock price and his own career prospects. James Crawford tried to recover some semblance of control, straightening his tie with hands that weren't quite steady. "Look, we may have gotten off on the wrong foot here, but let's not lose sight of the bigger picture. This is still a tremendous opportunity for both our companies." His voice carried the forced enthusiasm of a salesman trying to sell a car that had just caught fire in the parking lot. Sarah Chen nodded vigorously, shuffling her papers as if reorganizing documents could somehow reorganize the disaster unfolding around them. There's always room for renegotiation. These initial terms were just a starting point. But Hiroshi was already shaking his head, speaking in crisp, perfect English that made everyone in the room realize they had been played by a master strategist. "There will be no renegotiation," he said, his accent barely noticeable now that he wasn't pretending to struggle with the language. "This meeting is over, and Mr. Crawford, the bigger picture is that you've just shown me exactly why American pharmaceutical companies have the worst reputation for ethics in the developed world." The desperation was becoming palpable now, filling the room like smoke from a fire that was rapidly spreading out of control. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the marble floor with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. You can't just walk away from a deal this size over a misunderstanding. His voice cracked on the last word, revealing the panic that was building beneath his carefully constructed executive facade. We flew out here specifically for this meeting. We've invested months in due diligence, legal preparation, financial modeling. But Hiroshi was already gathering his papers, his movements deliberate and final, each gesture communicating that this wasn't a negotiation anymore, it was a verdict. Sophia watched the Americans' faces cycle through the stages of grief in real time, denial, anger, bargaining, and the dawning realization that they had just torpedoed their own billion-dollar deal through sheer arrogance and cultural blindness. The woman they had ignored all evening was about to become the most expensive mistake of their careers, and the man they had underestimated was about to teach them a lesson in respect that would cost them everything. Hiroshi rose from his chair with the dignified grace of an emperor dismissing his court, every movement calculated to communicate finality. The silver-haired billionaire who had sat quietly for 2 hours absorbing insults was gone, replaced by the commanding presence that had built a pharmaceutical empire from rubble and determination. When he spoke, his English was flawless, carrying only the faintest trace of an accent, the kind that suggested sophistication rather than struggle. "Gentlemen," he began, the word dripping with irony, "you have provided me with the most educational evening I've had in years. Not about pharmaceuticals or business strategy, but about the true character of the men I was asked to trust with my family's legacy." His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had just won a war without firing a shot, each word chosen with the precision of a surgeon making a final, decisive cut. Marcus opened his mouth to interrupt, but Hiroshi held up a single finger, not dismissively, but with the absolute confidence of someone who knew he controlled the conversation now. The transformation was complete and devastating. Sophia stood beside him now, no longer the invisible waitress, but his chosen translator, his cultural liaison, his witness to their professional suicide. "Mr. Nakamura has decided to accept a competing offer," she announced, her voice carrying the formal weight of a diplomatic pronouncement. "Takeshi International contacted him 3 days ago with terms that actually respect both his company's value and his employees' contributions." The color drained from David Park's face so quickly he looked like he might faint. Takeshi International wasn't just MedCorp's competitor. They were their biggest threat in the Asian market, the company that had been stealing contracts and market share for the past 5 years. Marcus tried to speak, but only managed a strangled sound that might have been protest or disbelief. "The deal will be announced Monday morning," Sophia continued with the calm efficiency of someone delivering a weather report. "Mr. Nakamura thought you might want to prepare your shareholders for the news that you lost the acquisition of the decade to competitors who actually bothered to show basic human respect." But Hiroshi wasn't finished. If anything, the worst was yet to come. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a folder that looked suspiciously similar to the contract Marcus had presented earlier, except this one was bound in elegant Japanese silk rather than corporate leather. "This," he said, placing it gently on the table, "is a detailed analysis of MedCorp's business practices that my team prepared over the past 6 months. Quality control violations in your Malaysian facilities, safety shortcuts in your Brazilian operations, the creative accounting methods you've used to inflate your quarterly reports." Each revelation landed like a physical blow, and Marcus could feel his carefully constructed empire beginning to crumble around him. "I was willing to overlook these concerns if you proved to be honorable partners. Instead, you've shown me that the reports were optimistic." Sarah Chen's papers slipped from her nerveless fingers, scattering across the floor like the remnants of her career prospects. The final sword thrust came with the quiet devastation of a master executioner ending a condemned man's suffering. Sophia smiled, not the professional service smile she had worn all evening, but the genuine expression of someone who had just watched justice served at the perfect temperature. "Oh, and gentlemen, Mr. Nakamura wanted you to know that he's been live-streaming this entire meeting to the International Pharmaceutical Ethics Committee." The silence that followed was so complete, it felt like the entire building had stopped breathing. Every joke about his English, every dismissive comment about Japanese business practices, every moment you revealed your plans to gut his company and fire his employees, it's been broadcasting live to regulatory officials in 12 countries. Marcus made a sound like a balloon deflating, while James Crawford actually grabbed his chest as if having a heart attack. The recording I mentioned earlier? That was just for legal documentation. This live stream, this was for the court of public opinion. Hiroshi bowed slightly, the gesture carrying all the elegance of a master swordsman sheathing his blade after a perfect duel. Sayonara, gentlemen. I hope you've learned something valuable tonight. I certainly have. The door opened like the final curtain call of a tragedy, and Hiroshi walked out with the measured steps of a man who had just won the most important battle of his career. But he didn't leave alone. He paused at the threshold, turned back to Sophia with the expression of someone who recognized not just an ally, but a kindred spirit who had risked everything to do what was right. In flawless Japanese, he spoke words that would change her life forever. Martinez-san, watakushi to isho ni kite kudasai. Anata no yu na hito ga hitsuyu desu. Come with me. I need someone like you. Sophia felt her breath catch in her throat, not just from the offer, but from the way he said it, with the respect reserved for equals, for partners, for people whose worth couldn't be measured by the uniform they wore or the color of their skin. She looked back at the devastated executives, at Marcus, who was frantically making phone calls to damage control specialists, at David Park, who was staring at his laptop screen like it might provide an escape route from reality. Then she untied her apron, folded it neatly and placed it on the table like a resignation letter written in silk. "I accept," she said in Japanese, then repeated it in English for the benefit of the men who were about to lose everything. "I accept, Mr. Nakamura's offer to join Zen Pharmaceuticals as Director of International Relations. The words felt like stepping off a cliff into free flight, terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Marcus looked up from his phone, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. "You can't just quit in the middle of service. You have responsibilities. You signed a contract." But his protests sounded hollow, desperate, like someone screaming at a departing train. Sophia turned to face him one final time, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had just discovered her own power. "The only contract I care about now is the one that treats people with dignity and respect. Something you've demonstrated you know nothing about." Her words hit harder than any insult because they carried the weight of truth that everyone in the room could feel. The transformation was complete and irreversible. The invisible waitress who had started the evening refilling wine glasses was walking out as an executive of a billion-dollar pharmaceutical company, arm in arm with the man who had just orchestrated the most elegant corporate takedown in recent memory. Behind them, they left a room full of men whose arrogance had cost them the deal of their careers, whose prejudices had blinded them to the intelligence and dignity of the people they were trying to exploit, whose assumptions about language barriers and cultural differences had led them into the most expensive trap of their professional lives. The recording would surface on financial news networks within hours. The live stream footage would become a case study in business schools about the dangers of cultural insensitivity and corporate arrogance. And Marcus Webb, who had walked into that room as the CEO of a major pharmaceutical company, would walk out as the man who lost billions because he couldn't show basic human respect to a Japanese businessman and the Latina woman who served his wine. As the elevator doors closed on their old lives and opened onto their new futures, Sophia realized that sometimes the most powerful moment in your life comes not when you're trying to be seen, but when you finally decide to stop being invisible. She had spent years perfecting the art of blending into the background, of being grateful for whatever opportunities came her way, of accepting that her intelligence and abilities would always be secondary to other people's assumptions about who she was and what she deserved. But tonight, in a room full of men who thought they owned the world, she had discovered something more valuable than any salary or job title. The understanding that respect isn't given based on your position. It's earned through your actions, your courage, and your willingness to stand up for what's right, even when it costs you everything you thought you wanted. The waitress was gone forever. In her place stood Sophia Martinez, Director of International Relations, partner in justice and living proof that the people you underestimate the most are often the ones with the power to change everything. The fallout began before their elevator reached the ground floor. By the time Hiroshi and Sophia stepped onto the marble lobby of the Chrysler building, Marcus's frantic phone calls had already set off a chain reaction that would topple careers and destroy reputations, with the efficiency of dominoes falling in perfect sequence. The livestream had been watched by over 50,000 viewers in real time. Pharmaceutical executives, regulatory officials, business journalists, and ethics watchdogs who had witnessed the most spectacular display of corporate arrogance in recent memory. Within 30 minutes, the hashtag #ChalkRespectInBusiness was trending on 3 continents, with clips of Marcus's condescending comments and Hiroshi's explosive Japanese response being shared faster than Medcorp's stock price was falling. The court of public opinion had rendered its verdict before the men in that dining room even realized they were on trial. By midnight, emergency board meetings were being called, crisis management teams were being assembled, and the executives who had walked into Azure Heights as masters of the universe were about to discover what it felt like to be unemployed. Marcus Webb's career died at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Medcorp's board of directors issued a terse statement announcing his immediate resignation to pursue other opportunities. The golden parachute he had negotiated so carefully was shredded by clauses about conduct detrimental to company interests and actions resulting in significant reputational damage. His corner office was cleared out by security before sunrise, his access cards deactivated, his company car keys confiscated, along with his executive privileges and his carefully constructed image as a pharmaceutical visionary. James Crawford lasted until noon the next day, when footage surfaced of him making jokes about bonsai tree negotiations at a previous investor meeting. Apparently, cultural insensitivity was a pattern, not an aberration. Sarah Chen's law firm dropped Medcorp as a client within 24 hours, citing irreconcilable differences in professional values, which was legal speak for "we don't want to be associated with racist idiots." David Park simply disappeared, his LinkedIn profile deleted, his social media account scrubbed, like a man trying to erase himself from professional existence entirely. The media circus was swift, brutal, and absolutely merciless. Financial news networks ran the story with headlines like "Billion-Dollar Bigotry," "How Cultural Arrogance Cost Medcorp the Deal of the Decade." Business journals analyzed every frame of the live stream footage, dissecting the moment when unconscious bias became explicit prejudice, when professional confidence became personal humiliation. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story titled "The Waitress Who Toppled Wall Street," featuring Sophia's photograph alongside Hiroshi's, both of them looking dignified and powerful in a way that made the absent Medcorp executives seem small and petty by comparison. International publications picked up the story as a perfect example of American corporate arrogance meeting its match in global business ethics. The phrase "never underestimate the quiet ones" became a rallying cry for service industry workers everywhere, while "respect is universal currency" appeared on motivational posters in office buildings across the country. But the most delicious irony came 6 months later, when Zen Pharmaceuticals announced their merger with Takeshi International had generated the largest pharmaceutical research breakthrough in a decade, a cancer treatment that would save millions of lives and generate billions in revenue, for the partners who had actually shown respect for innovation over exploitation. Sophia, now fluent in Mandarin and serving as the Director of Global Partnerships, stood beside Hiroshi at the press conference announcing the treatment's success. She wore a designer suit instead of a service uniform, spoke with the authority of someone whose intelligence was finally being recognized, and carried herself with the confidence that comes from knowing your worth isn't determined by other people's assumptions. The cameras captured her smile as she translated not just languages, but the message that had started this whole journey. Sometimes the people you never see coming are the ones who change the world. And sometimes the biggest mistake you can make is treating someone's silence as stupidity, their service as servitude, or their respect as weakness. Marcus Webb, watching from his unemployment line, finally understood the lesson. It just cost him everything to learn it.